Story 1. The Haunting of Willow Creek. Willow Creek was a quiet, unassuming town nestled between rolling hills and dense forests. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and secrets had a way of weaving themselves into the fabric of daily life. It was here, in this idyllic setting, that the Thorne family decided to start anew. Jacob and Emily Thorne had been searching for the perfect place to raise their young daughter, Lily. They wanted a house that felt like a home, a place where they could build memories and watch their child grow. When they stumbled upon the old colonial at the edge of Willow Creek, they knew they had found it. The house was beautiful, with its white picket fence, sprawling front lawn, and towering oak trees that shaded the yard. It had character, history, and a charm that was hard to resist. The real estate agent had mentioned that the house had been on the market for quite some time, but Jacob and Emily didn't pay much attention to that. They were too captivated by the idea of what the house could become a sanctuary for their family. The day they moved in was filled with the usual chaos of boxes, furniture, and the excited chatter of a family embarking on a new chapter. As they unpacked, neighbors stopped by to introduce themselves, offering homemade pies and warm welcomes. It was all so perfect that it felt like a dream. But dreams, as Jacob and Emily would soon discover, can quickly turn into nightmares. It started with the whispers. At first, Emily thought it was just the wind. The old house creaked and groaned as the autumn breeze blew through the trees, and she dismissed the soft murmurs she heard late at night as nothing more than the house settling. But as the days passed, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. She would be in the kitchen, washing dishes, when she heard them faint voices that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but there was an urgency to them that sent a shiver down her spine. "Jacob, do you hear that?" she asked one evening, as they sat in the living room after putting Lily to bed. "Hear what?" Jacob replied, looking up from the book he was reading, The Whispers. "It's like someone is trying to talk to us." Jacob chuckled, dismissing her concerns with a wave of his hand. "It's an old house, Em. You know how these places are. Creaks, groans, the wind, it's all just part of the charm." But Emily wasn't so sure. There was something unsettling about the whispers, something that felt wrong. A few nights later, she was woken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Groggy and disoriented, she sat up in bed, straining to listen. The footsteps were soft, almost hesitant, as if someone was tiptoeing through the house. She glanced over at Jacob, who was sound asleep beside her, and then at the baby monitor on the nightstand. The soft hum of Lily's breathing came through the speaker, steady and calm. Emily slipped out of bed, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and crept to the door. She slowly opened it, peering into the dimly lit hallway. The footsteps had stopped, but she could feel a presence, something watching her from the shadows. "Hello," she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the oppressive silence of the house. She took a few steps forward, her heart pounding in her chest. The hallway was empty, the doors to the other rooms closed. Everything was still, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. Suddenly, the door to Lily's room creaked open, and Emily's breath caught in her throat. She hurried to the door, her hands trembling as she pushed it open. Lily was sound asleep in her crib, her small chest rising and falling with each breath. The nightlight cast a soft glow over the room, and everything seemed peaceful. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her like a dark cloud. As she stood there, watching her daughter sleep, she heard it again, the whispers. They were louder this time, insistent, as if they were trying to tell her something. She spun around, searching the room for the source, but there was nothing. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Emily backed out of the room, her heart racing, and closed the door behind her. She hurried back to bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, and lay there wide-eyed until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains. The next morning, she told Jacob about the footsteps and the whispers. He listened patiently, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. "I'm telling you, Jacob, something isn't right in this house," she insisted. "You're just stressed," Jacob said, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Moving is a big change, and this house is old. It's bound to have its quirks. Why don't we take a day off and go explore the town? Get out of the house for a bit?" Emily reluctantly agreed, though the unease lingered in the back of her mind. They spent the day wandering through Willow Creek, visiting the quaint shops and chatting with the friendly locals. The town was charming, with its cobblestone streets and historic buildings, and for a few hours, Emily was able to push her fears aside. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the town, a strange tension settled over her. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They stopped at a small cafe for dinner, and while they waited for their food, an elderly woman at the next table struck up a conversation with them. "You're the ones who bought the old Collins place, aren't you?" the woman asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Jacob nodded. "Yes, we just moved in a few days ago. It's a beautiful house." The woman's expression darkened, and she glanced around the cafe as if to make sure no one was listening. "You be careful in that house," she warned. "That place has a history, a dark one. The Collins family. Well, let's just say they didn't leave that house by choice." Emily's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" The woman leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. The Collins family was a well-respected family in Willow Creek. Mr. Collins was a prominent businessman, and Mrs. Collins was known for her charity work. But about 10 years ago, something changed. People started noticing strange things, lights flickering in the windows at odd hours, shadows moving through the house when no one was home. And then, one day, the entire family just disappeared. No one ever saw them again. "Disappeared?" Jacob echoed, his skepticism clear. The woman nodded solemnly. "Vanished without a trace. The police searched the house from top to bottom, but they never found any evidence of foul play. The house has been empty ever since until you moved in." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you think happened to them?" The woman shook her head, her eyes clouded with fear. "No one knows for sure. Some say they were cursed. Others believe the house itself is evil. All I know is that no good ever came from that place." The rest of the evening passed in a blur, Emily's mind racing with the woman's words. When they returned home, the house seemed different, darker, more oppressive. The whispers were back, louder than ever, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were no longer just whispers, but voices, angry, desperate voices that filled the room with their malevolent energy. "Get out," they hissed. "You don't belong here." Emily clapped her hands over her ears, trying to block out the voices, but they only grew louder, more insistent. She felt something cold brush against her skin, and she sat up in bed, her eyes wide with terror. The room was dark, the shadows deep and impenetrable. But there, at the foot of the bed, she saw them, figures, barely visible in the darkness, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. "Jacob," she screamed, shaking him awake. Jacob bolted upright, his eyes wide with alarm. "What is it? What's wrong? Don't you see them?" Emily cried, pointing to the foot of the bed. Jacob squinted into the darkness, but he saw nothing. There's nothing there." But Emily knew better. The figures were there, watching them, their presence filling the room with an oppressive darkness that seemed to seep into her very soul. "Please, Jacob, we have to leave," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "This house, it's not right. It's evil." Jacob pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she sobbed. "It's okay, Em. We'll leave. We'll pack up in the morning and get out of here." But morning never came. The next day, Emily woke to the sound of silence. The house was unnervingly still, the only noise the distant chirping of birds outside. She turned over in bed, expecting to see Jacob beside her, but the space where he usually lay was empty. The sheets were cold, as if he had been gone for some time. A sudden wave of unease washed over her as she sat up, her eyes scanning the room. "Jacob," she called out, her voice wavering. There was no answer. Emily felt a knot form in her stomach as she threw the covers off and got out of bed. The house seemed eerily quiet, almost as if it were holding its breath. She hurried down the hallway to Lily's room, her heart pounding in her chest. When she pushed open the door, her breath caught in her throat. The crib was empty. "Lily!" Emily's voice cracked with panic as she rushed to the crib, her hands trembling as she searched the room. But her daughter was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Desperation surged through her as she ran through the house, calling out for Jacob and Lily. She searched every room, every closet, but they were gone. The house remained oppressively silent, the only sound the rapid beating of her own heart, and then she heard it, a faint cry, distant and muffled. It was Lily. Emily's heart leaped as she followed the sound, leading her down the hallway to the basement door. She hesitated for a moment, fear clutching at her, but the sound of her daughter's cries gave her the strength to push the door open. The basement was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. Emily flicked the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb was dead. She cursed under her breath and fumbled for her phone, using the dim glow of the screen to light her way. The cries grew louder as she descended the creaking wooden stairs, each step taking her deeper into the darkness. The basement was large, with low ceilings and walls lined with old, dusty shelves. As she reached the bottom, the cries stopped abruptly, leaving Emily in a deafening silence. "Lily," she whispered, her voice echoing off the cold stone walls. The basement was empty. Emily's pulse quickened as she frantically searched the room, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. She knew she had heard Lily's voice. She had been so certain of it. But now, standing alone in the dark, doubt began to creep in. "Jacob," she called out again, but the silence pressed in on her, heavy and suffocating. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, plunging Emily into complete darkness. She gasped, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. Panic surged through her as she dropped to her knees, desperately searching for the phone, her fingers trembling. And then she felt it, a cold, clammy hand brushing against her ankle. Emily screamed and scrambled backward, her hands scraping against the rough concrete floor. Her mind raced, and she felt the walls closing in around her, the darkness so thick it was as if she were drowning in it. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice shaking with terror. There was no answer, only the sound of heavy breathing, slow, deliberate, and chilling. Emily's back hit the wall, and she pressed herself against it, trying to make herself as small as possible. The breathing grew closer until she could feel the cold breath on her face. In the pitch-black darkness, she could see nothing, but she knew it was there, whatever it was. The presence loomed over her, oppressive and malevolent, filling her with a primal fear that rooted her to the spot, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence was gone. The basement was silent once more, but the air was thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. Emily forced herself to move, to crawl forward and retrieve her phone. The light flickered on, dim and shaky, but it was enough to see by. She took a deep breath and stood up, her legs trembling beneath her. She knew she had to get out of the basement, out of the house. Whatever had taken Jacob and Lily, whatever had haunted the Collins family, was coming for her next. She bolted for the stairs, taking them two at a time. But as she reached the top, the basement door wouldn't budge. She yanked on the handle, her panic rising as she realized she was trapped. "Please," she screamed, banging on the door with her fists. "Someone help me." The door remained firmly shut, and Emily felt the weight of despair settling over her. She was alone, trapped in the dark, with no way out. And then, as if in answer to her desperate pleas, the door creaked open. Emily didn't waste a moment. She threw the door open and rushed out of the basement, slamming it shut behind her. She leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she tried to calm herself, but the house was no longer the sanctuary it had once been. The walls seemed to close in around her, the shadows deepening, as if the house itself were alive, feeding on her fear. Emily knew she couldn't stay. She had to find Jacob and Lily and get out of Willow Creek before it was too late. She grabbed her coat and keys, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the door. She could hear the whispers again, louder this time, filling her head with a cacophony of voices that made it impossible to think. "Get out. Get out. Get out." Emily yanked the door open and stumbled outside, the cold morning air hitting her like a slap in the face. She took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind, but the whispers followed her, echoing in her mind as she ran toward the car. But as she reached the driveway, she stopped dead in her tracks. The car was gone. Panic surged through her. She knew they had parked it right there the night before, but now there was nothing but an empty stretch of gravel. Her heart pounded in her chest as she looked around, hoping to see some sign of Jacob or Lily, but the street was eerily quiet, the houses around her dark and silent. She was alone. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to make sense of what was happening. Everything felt surreal, like she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake from. The edges of her vision blurred, and she felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. She needed help. She needed to get away from the house, from the voices, from whatever darkness had taken over her life. Without thinking, she began running down the street, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the morning. The town was quiet, too quiet, as if the world had been drained of all life. She passed house after house, each one as silent and empty as the last. Where was everyone? Where was Jacob? Where was Lily? She could feel the whispers growing louder in her mind, a constant hum that threatened to drown out her thoughts. The panic built in her chest until she felt like she couldn't breathe. Finally, she reached the center of town. The familiar cafe where they had spoken to the old woman the night before was just ahead. Emily stumbled toward it, hoping to find someone, anyone who could help her, but when she pushed open the door, the cafe was empty. The chairs were neatly arranged, the tables wiped clean, but there wasn't a single person in sight. It was as if the entire town had been abandoned overnight. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the door, her mind racing with possibilities. Had everyone left? Had something happened while they were asleep? Or was she imagining it all? She felt the weight of the silence pressing down on her, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse under the pressure. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure standing in the shadows at the far end of the street. "Jacob," Emily called out, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move. "Jacob, is that you?" But as she stepped closer, she realized with growing dread that it wasn't Jacob. The figure was tall, much taller than her husband, and it seemed to be shrouded in darkness, its features obscured by a heavy cloak of shadow. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she froze in place, her eyes locked on the figure. It stood there, unmoving, watching her with an intensity that made her skin crawl, and then, without warning, the figure began to move toward her. Emily's instincts kicked in, and she turned on her heel, sprinting back down the street as fast as she could. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the presence behind her, growing closer with every step. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more frantic, as if they were urging her to run faster, to escape whatever was chasing her. But no matter how fast she ran, the figure seemed to be right behind her, its footsteps echoing in her ears. Just as she thought she couldn't run any farther, Emily spotted a house with its lights on a beacon of hope in the otherwise desolate town. She veered off the road, racing up the driveway and pounding on the door with all her strength. "Please, let me in," she cried, her voice hoarse with desperation. The door opened just a crack, and an elderly man peered out at her, his eyes filled with concern. "What's going on, miss? Are you all right? Please, you have to help me," Emily gasped, glancing over her shoulder. "There's something chasing me." The man's eyes widened, and he quickly pulled the door open, allowing Emily to stumble inside. He shut the door behind her and locked it, then turned to face her with a worried expression. "What happened? Who's after you?" "I don't know," Emily stammered, her hands shaking as she tried to catch her breath. "I don't know what it is, but it's been following me ever since I left the house." The man's expression darkened. "The Collins place?" Emily nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. "Yes. Please, you have to help me find my husband and daughter. They're missing. I think something took them." The man's shoulders sagged as he let out a heavy sigh. "You shouldn't have moved into that house," he said quietly. "I've lived in this town all my life, and I've seen what that place can do. The Collins family. They didn't just disappear. The house took them, just like it's trying to take you." Emily's blood ran cold as she stared at the man in horror. "What do you mean, the house took them?" He gestured for her to sit down, and she reluctantly did, her heart pounding in her chest. The man sat across from her, his gaze somber. "There's something evil in that house," he explained. "Something that's been there for as long as anyone can remember. It feeds on fear, on the energy of the living. The Collins family, they were just the latest victims. But there have been others before them. People who vanished without a trace, their fates sealed within those walls." Emily shook her head, refusing to believe what she was hearing. "No, that's impossible. There has to be some explanation." "There is," the man interrupted gently, "and it's the one you don't want to hear. That house is a trap designed to lure in the unsuspecting and feed on their souls. It's been doing it for centuries, and it won't stop until it's destroyed." Emily's mind raced, trying to process everything he was saying. "But how? How do we destroy it?" The man hesitated, his eyes filled with sorrow. "I don't know if it can be destroyed, but there might be a way to break its hold on you, to get your family back. Tell me," Emily pleaded. "I'll do anything." The man nodded, standing up and walking over to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. He rummaged through it for a moment before pulling out an old, leather-bound book. He handed it to Emily, his expression grim. "This is the diary of one of the house's earliest victims, a woman named Eleanor Cartwright. She lived there in the 1800s, before the town was even founded. She wrote about the things she experienced in that house, the horrors she witnessed. But she also wrote about a ritual, a way to confront the evil and banish it from this world." Emily opened the book with trembling hands, scanning the pages filled with Eleanor's desperate handwriting. The words were barely legible in some places, but the fear and anguish were clear. "It's risky," the man warned. "The ritual requires confronting the entity head-on, and if it fails, well, let's just say you might not make it out alive." Emily looked up at him, determination hardening her features. "I have to try. I can't leave Jacob and Lily behind. I have to save them." The man nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of respect and sorrow. "Then you'll need to prepare. The ritual must be performed at midnight in the heart of the house. You'll need these." He handed her a small pouch filled with strange, pungent herbs, a silver dagger with intricate carvings, and a candle that emitted an eerie green glow when lit. "These are the tools Eleanor used in her attempt to banish the evil," the man explained. "You'll need to use them during the ritual. But be warned, the entity will fight back. It will do everything in its power to break you, to keep you from completing the ritual." Emily nodded, clutching the items to her chest. "Thank you. I won't let it win." The man placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. "May God be with you, child. You'll need all the strength you can muster." Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for the battle ahead. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she had no other choice. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to save her family. With renewed determination, she thanked the man and left his house, the diary and ritual items safely tucked into her coat. The sun had set by the time she reached the old colonial, the sky a deep, foreboding shade of purple. The house loomed before her, its windows dark and menacing. The whispers had returned, louder and more insistent than ever, but Emily ignored them. She would not be swayed by fear. She stepped inside, her heart pounding as she made her way to the center of the house, the parlor, where she and Jacob had first sat down to discuss their plans for their new life. The air was thick with tension, and the shadows seemed to move of their own accord, but Emily forced herself to stay focused. She drew a circle on the floor with the herbs, then placed the candle at its center and lit it. The green glow filled the room, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Finally, she took the silver dagger and stood at the edge of the circle, her hands trembling as she prepared to begin the ritual. "Spirits of this house," she called out, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "I know you are here. I know you have taken my family, but I am not afraid of you. I will not let you keep them." The whispers grew louder, filling her head with a cacophony of voices, but Emily pressed on, reciting the words from Eleanor's diary. "I call upon the light to banish the darkness. I call upon the strength of my love to break the chains that bind us. I command you, Spirit, to release my family and leave this place forever." The temperature in the room plummeted, and the walls began to shake. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for her. But Emily stood her ground, gripping the dagger tightly as she repeated the incantation. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the room, and a powerful gust of wind extinguished the candle. The green light vanished, plunging the room into darkness. Emily's heart raced as she felt the presence closing in on her, the air around her growing thick and suffocating. The entity was furious, its anger palpable as it tried to break her will, but she would not give in. With a final burst of strength, Emily raised the dagger and drove it into the center of the circle, shouting the last words of the ritual with all the power she could muster. "I command you to be gone." For a moment there was silence, and then a blinding flash of light filled the room, followed by a soul-piercing scream that seemed to come from all around her. The house shook violently, and Emily was thrown to the floor as the ground beneath her trembled, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The silence was deafening as Emily slowly got to her feet, her body aching from the force of the fall. The shadows on the walls were gone, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the house had lifted. Had she done it? Had she banished the entity? She looked around, her heart pounding with anticipation, and then she saw them, Jacob and Lily, standing in the doorway, their faces pale but alive. "Jacob," Emily cried, rushing to them and wrapping them both in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her face as she held them close, the relief overwhelming her. "Emily," Jacob whispered, his voice trembling. "What happened? Where are we?" "It's okay," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "We're safe now. The house. It's over. We're free." They stood there for what felt like an eternity, holding each other as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The entity was gone, banished by the ritual, and they were finally free from its grasp. As they left the house behind, the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the town. Willow Creek was quiet once more. The darkness that had plagued it for so long finally lifted, and as they drove away, Emily couldn't help but glance back at the house one last time. It stood there, silent and still, but she knew it would never be the same. They had won. But deep down, she knew that the evil that had haunted Willow Creek was still out there, waiting for its next victim, and she prayed that no one would ever be foolish enough to step into that house again. Story 2. The Forgotten Asylum. It was supposed to be a weekend of fun, an adventure to shake off the monotony of college life. A group of 5 friends, Sarah, Mark, Jess, Dylan, and Olivia, had decided to spend the weekend exploring an abandoned mental asylum that had long been rumored to be haunted. It was the kind of place that had become the stuff of local legend, whispered about in hushed tones, and visited by thrill-seekers eager to test their courage. Nestled deep in the woods, miles away from any town, the old Hawthorne Asylum had been shut down in the 1960s after reports of abuse and unethical experiments on the patients became too much for the authorities to ignore. Since then, it had stood as a decaying monument to a dark past, its halls left to the mercy of time and nature. The group arrived at the asylum just as the sun was beginning to set, the sky ablaze with fiery oranges and reds that cast an eerie glow over the crumbling building. The wrought iron gates, which had once kept the patients in, now hung open, as if inviting them to enter. Vines and ivy had overtaken much of the outer walls, and the windows, now shattered, stared back at them like empty eye sockets. "This place is seriously creepy," Olivia said, her voice tinged with nervous excitement as she looked up at the towering structure. "That's the point, Liv," Mark replied with a grin, adjusting the straps of his backpack. "We didn't drive all the way out here to be bored." "Besides," Dylan added, pulling out his phone to record the moment, "think of the stories we'll have to tell when we get back." "This place is legendary for being haunted," Jess said, shivering despite the warm evening air. "Are we really doing this?" Sarah, the de facto leader of the group, stepped forward, her expression resolute. "We're doing this. We'll spend the night here, explore the place, and maybe we'll find some proof of the supernatural. But if anyone wants to back out, now's the time to say so. Double quotes. No one moved. "Good," Sarah said with a nod. "Let's go." They pushed through the gates and made their way toward the main entrance, the gravel crunching under their feet. The front doors of the asylum were heavy and wooden, their once vibrant paint now peeling and faded. With a little effort, Dylan managed to push one of them open, the hinges creaking loudly in protest. The inside of the asylum was even darker and more foreboding than the exterior. Dust motes floated in the air, illuminated by the dying light that filtered through the broken windows. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floors were littered with debris, old newspapers, broken furniture, and remnants of the asylum's former life. "This place gives me the creeps," Jess muttered, clutching her flashlight tightly as she looked around. "Exactly why it's going to be awesome," Mark said, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous entrance hall. "We'll split up and cover more ground. Sarah, you and Dylan take the west wing. Jess and I will take the east wing. Olivia, You can stay here and be our lookout." Olivia rolled her eyes but nodded. "Fine, but if I hear anything weird, I'm out." "Deal," Mark said, giving her a playful salute before turning to Jess. "Ready to go?" "Not really, but let's do it anyway," Jess replied, her voice shaky. As the group split up, Olivia watched them disappear into the darkness, the beams of their flashlights cutting through the gloom. She turned back to the entrance, trying to ignore the oppressive feeling of being watched. It was just her imagination, she told herself. The asylum was just an old building, abandoned and forgotten. There was nothing to be afraid of. But as she stood there, alone in the dark, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. Sarah and Dylan made their way through the west wing, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay, and every sound seemed amplified in the silence. "This place must have been a nightmare when it was operational," Dylan said, shining his flashlight down a long, dark corridor. "Can you imagine being stuck here?" "Yeah, no wonder it's haunted," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can almost feel the despair in the walls." They passed by several rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. The walls were covered in graffiti, the windows shattered, and the furniture reduced to piles of rubble. It was hard to imagine that this place had once been full of patients, doctors, nurses, all of them now long gone. They stopped in front of a door marked Ward A. The paint on the door was faded, but the letters were still visible. Sarah pushed it open, revealing a large room lined with metal beds, their mattresses rotting and stained. "Creepy," Dylan muttered, stepping inside. "I bet this place has some serious ghost stories. Let's hope we don't become one of them," Sarah replied, scanning the room with her flashlight. As they explored the ward, Dylan's phone suddenly crackled to life, the screen flickering as it tried to connect to a signal. "Whoa, did you see that?" he said, holding up the phone. "I think I got something." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked, moving closer. Dylan played back the recording, and they both listened intently. At first, there was nothing but static, but then, faintly, they heard a low guttural moan that sent chills down their spines. "Did you hear that?" Dylan asked, his eyes wide. "Yeah," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. "We need to get this back to the others." They quickly made their way out of the ward, but as they stepped into the hallway, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening bang. Both of them jumped, their flashlights swinging wildly as they tried to see what had caused it, but there was nothing there. "Okay, that was definitely not the wind," Dylan said, his voice trembling. "Let's just find the others," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. They hurried down the corridor, but no matter how far they walked, the hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly. Every door they passed looked the same. Every turn led them deeper into the maze of the asylum. "I don't remember this place being this big," Dylan muttered, glancing over his shoulder nervously. "Neither do I," Sarah replied, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. "We need to get out of here," but the more they tried to find their way back, the more disoriented they became. The walls seemed to close in on them, the air growing colder and thicker with every step. "We're lost," Dylan said, panic creeping into his voice. "We're fucking lost. Calm down," Sarah snapped, trying to keep her own fear in check. "We'll find our way back. We just need to stay calm." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. Something was wrong with this place, something beyond the physical. It was as if the asylum itself was alive, twisting and warping reality to trap them inside. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The hallway seemed to shift around them, and they found themselves standing in front of the entrance hall where they had started. "What the hell?" Dylan breathed, looking around in confusion. "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "But we need to find the others and get out of here." Meanwhile, on the other side of the asylum, Jess and Mark were having their own unsettling experience. They had explored several rooms in the East Wing, each one more disturbing than the last. The walls were covered in strange symbols, the furniture overturned, and the floors littered with decaying medical equipment. "This place is a freak show," Mark said, kicking aside a rusty bedpan. "Yeah, no kidding," Jess replied, her voice shaky. "I don't know how much more of this I can take. Let's just check out one more room," Mark said, nodding toward a door at the end of the hall. "Then we'll head back." Jess reluctantly agreed, and they approached the door. It was labeled Treatment Room 3, and the handle was cold to the touch. Mark pushed it open, revealing a small room with a single metal chair bolted to the floor. Straps hung limply from the armrests, and a large cracked mirror covered one wall. "What do you think they did in here?" Jess asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever it was, it wasn't good," Mark replied, stepping inside. As they looked around, the door suddenly slammed shut behind them with a loud bang. Jess yelped in surprise, her flashlight flickering as she spun around. "What the hell?" she cried, rushing to the door and trying to open it. But the handle wouldn't budge. "It's locked." "From the outside?" Mark asked, moving to help her. But no matter how hard they pulled, the door remained firmly shut. "This isn't happening," Jess whispered, panic rising in her chest. "We're trapped. Calm down," Mark said, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's got to be another way out." But as they searched the room, it became clear that there wasn't. The walls were solid, the windows barred, and the door wouldn't open. They were completely sealed in, and then, just as the panic was about to overwhelm them, the mirror on the wall cracked, a jagged line spreading across the glass. Both of them froze, staring at the mirror in horrified silence. Slowly, the crack widened, and something began to push through the glass. It was pale and twisted, its features distorted as if it were being pulled from another world. Jess and Mark could only watch in terror as the thing crawled out of the mirror and into the room with them. It was humanoid, but barely. Its skin was ashen and stretched tightly over its bones, its eyes sunken and black. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if it had forgotten how to use its limbs. "Jess, run!" Mark shouted, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the door. But the creature was faster. It lunged at them with a shriek, its long, bony fingers grasping for their throats. Mark shoved Jess out of the way just in time, and the creature's claws raked across his chest, leaving deep, bloody gashes. Mark stumbled back, gasping in pain as the creature turned its attention to Jess. She backed away, her flashlight trembling in her hand as she pointed it at the thing. The beam of light seemed to momentarily confuse it, and it hesitated, giving Jess just enough time to scramble to her feet. "Come on, Mark," she cried, grabbing his hand and pulling him toward the door. But Mark was already weakening, the blood from his wounds soaking through his shirt. He fell to his knees, his vision blurring as the creature advanced on him again. "Go," he gasped, pushing Jess away. "Get out of here." "I'm not leaving you," Jess screamed, tears streaming down her face as she tried to pull him up. But it was too late. The creature lunged at Mark again, its claws sinking into his flesh as it dragged him back toward the mirror. Jess could only watch in horror as Mark was pulled into the glass, his screams echoing in her ears, until they were abruptly cut off, the mirror shattered, and Mark was gone. Jess fell to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. She was alone, trapped in the room with the shattered remains of the mirror and the bloodstains on the floor. She didn't know how long she lay there, paralyzed with grief and terror. Time seemed to lose all meaning in that room, the walls closing in around her until she couldn't tell where she ended and the asylum began. Finally, she forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking as she stumbled to the door. It was still locked, but she didn't care. She pounded on it with her fists, screaming for help, until her voice was hoarse and her hands were bruised and bloody, but no one came. Back at the entrance hall, Sarah and Dylan were frantic. They had managed to find their way back, but Olivia was nowhere to be seen. Her flashlight lay on the floor, abandoned, and the door to the asylum was wide open, as if she had run out in a panic. "Where the hell is she?" Dylan muttered, pacing back and forth. "She wouldn't just leave without us, would she?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "But we need to find her, and Jess and Mark." "Something's wrong with this place," Dylan nodded, his face pale with fear. "Yeah, no shit. Let's just get everyone and get the hell out of here." They made their way back through the asylum, calling out for their friends as they went. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in around them as they walked. It was as if the asylum was trying to swallow them whole, to keep them trapped within its decaying walls. Finally, they heard a faint, muffled sobbing coming from one of the rooms. Sarah and Dylan exchanged a glance, then hurried toward the sound. They found Jess huddled in the corner of a small room, her face pale and tear-streaked. She looked up at them with wide, terrified eyes as they entered. "Jess," Sarah cried, rushing to her side. "What happened? Where's Mark?" Jess didn't answer. She just shook her head, her body trembling with silent sobs. "Jess, we need to go," Dylan said, his voice urgent. "We need to get out of here," but Jess didn't move. She seemed to be in shock, her eyes glazed over, as if she were somewhere else entirely. Sarah and Dylan exchanged a worried glance, then each took one of Jess's arms, pulling her to her feet. They led her out of the room and back down the hallway, but every step felt like they were moving deeper into the heart of darkness. Finally, they reached the entrance hall, but the door was no longer open. It was shut, the heavy wooden doors seemingly locked from the outside. "No, no, no," Dylan cried, pounding on the doors with his fists. "This can't be happening. We were just outside." Sarah tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic surged through her as she looked around the dark, empty hall. The asylum was alive, feeding off their fear, trapping them inside its decaying walls. "We need to find another way out," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "There has to be another exit," but as they turned to leave the entrance hall, they heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps echoing through the darkness. The air grew thick with dread as they realized they were no longer alone. "Who's there?" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the sound of the footsteps growing closer. "Run," Dylan shouted, grabbing Sarah and Jess and pulling them toward the nearest hallway. They sprinted through the asylum, their hearts pounding in their chests as they tried to outrun the footsteps that echoed behind them. Every turn seemed to lead them deeper into the maze, the walls closing in around them, the air growing colder and thicker with every step. Finally, they burst into a large, open room, the walls lined with old medical equipment and rusted cages. They slammed the door shut behind them, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they tried to catch their breath, but the footsteps didn't stop. They were right outside the door, slow and deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was following them was toying with them. "Sarah, what do we do?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. Sarah didn't answer. She was too busy scanning the room, looking for anything they could use to defend themselves. Her eyes landed on a rusted metal pipe leaning against the wall. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She grabbed the pipe and turned to face the door, her heart pounding in her chest. Dylan and Jess stood behind her, their faces pale with fear. The footsteps stopped outside the door, and for a moment there was silence, and then the door burst open with a deafening crash, and the creature from the mirror lunged into the room. It was even more horrifying up close. Its skin was ashen and stretched tightly over its bones, its eyes sunken and black. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, as if it had forgotten how to use its limbs. Sarah swung the pipe with all her strength, but the creature was too fast. It dodged the blow and lunged at her, its claws raking across her arm. She screamed in pain, stumbling back as the creature advanced on her again. But before it could strike, Dylan charged at it with a shout, tackling it to the ground. "Get out of here," he shouted at Sarah and Jess. "Go. I'll hold it off." But Sarah couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her mind racing with fear as she watched Dylan struggle with the creature. "Sarah, go," Dylan shouted, his voice desperate. Finally, the spell was broken. Sarah grabbed Jess's arm and pulled her toward the door. But as they reached the threshold, they heard Dylan scream. They turned just in time to see the creature sink its claws into Dylan's chest, pulling him down to the ground. His eyes locked onto Sarah's, a mix of fear and resignation in his gaze, before the creature dragged him into the darkness. "Dylan," Sarah screamed, tears streaming down her face. But it was too late. Dylan was gone. Jess pulled Sarah out of the room, and they ran through the asylum, their hearts pounding in their chests as they tried to find a way out. Finally, they stumbled upon a staircase leading down into the basement. It wasn't an ideal escape route, but it was the only option they had left. They descended the stairs, their footsteps echoing in the narrow, winding stairwell. The air grew colder and more oppressive the deeper they went, the darkness closing in around them like a suffocating shroud. At the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a long, narrow hallway lined with metal doors. Each door had a small, barred window at eye level, and as they passed, they could feel something watching them from the other side. "This place is a fucking nightmare," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Just keep moving," Sarah replied, trying to keep her own fear in check. They finally reached the end of the hallway and found themselves standing in front of a heavy metal door. Sarah tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "No, no, no," Jess cried, pounding on the door with her fists. "This can't be happening." Sarah frantically searched for another way out, but the hallway was a dead end. They were trapped, and then they heard the slow, deliberate sound of footsteps echoing through the darkness. The creature was coming for them. Sarah and Jess backed away from the door, their hearts pounding in their chests as they realized they had nowhere left to run. The footsteps grew closer, and the air grew colder and thicker with dread. The walls seemed to close in around them, the darkness swallowing them whole. Finally, the footsteps stopped just outside the door. For a moment, there was silence, and then the door burst open with a deafening crash, and the creature lunged into the hallway. Sarah and Jess screamed, but there was nowhere to run. The creature advanced on them, its claws outstretched, ready to drag them into the darkness, but just as it was about to strike, the door at the other end of the hallway burst open, flooding the corridor with light. "Sarah, Jess, over here," a voice shouted. It was Olivia. She stood in the doorway, her flashlight aimed at the creature. The light seemed to confuse it, and it hesitated, giving Sarah and Jess just enough time to run past it and into the stairwell. "Go, go, go," Olivia shouted, slamming the door shut behind them. They ran up the stairs, their hearts pounding in their chests as they tried to put as much distance between themselves and the creature as possible. Finally, they burst out of the asylum and into the cool night air. They didn't stop running until they reached the car. "Get in, get in," Olivia shouted, fumbling with the keys. They piled into the car, slamming the doors shut behind them. Olivia started the engine, and they sped away from the asylum, the tires kicking up gravel as they tore down the dirt road. For a long time, no one spoke. They just sat there, breathing heavily, their minds racing with what had just happened. Finally, Sarah broke the silence. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," Olivia replied, her voice trembling. "But we're lucky to be alive." Jess just sat there, staring out the window, her eyes glazed over with shock. They drove in silence for what felt like hours, the events of the night replaying in their minds over and over again. Finally, they reached the outskirts of town. Olivia pulled into a gas station, and they all got out of the car, their legs shaking as they tried to steady themselves. "We need to call the police," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to tell them what happened." But as they stood there, trying to make sense of everything, they realized something chilling. The asylum was gone. They looked back down the road, but the building that had haunted their every step was nowhere to be seen. It was as if it had never existed. "This isn't possible," Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "Did we imagine it?" Olivia asked, her eyes wide with fear. "No," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "It was real." It was all real. They stood there in silence, the reality of what had happened settling over them like a heavy shroud. They had escaped the asylum, but they knew they would never truly be free of it. The memories of that night would haunt them forever, and as they looked back down the road, they couldn't help but wonder if the asylum was still out there, somewhere, waiting for its next victims. Story 3: The Woodsman's Curse. Deep in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, where the towering pines seemed to scrape the sky and the mist clung to the ground like a shroud, there was a forest that locals spoke of only in hushed tones. It was a place where no one dared to tread, a place where the trees whispered ancient secrets and the shadows danced with malevolent intent. This was the territory of the cursed Woodsman, a figure of local legend, said to haunt the forest, seeking revenge on those who dared to enter his domain. No one knew exactly when the stories had begun, but they had been passed down through generations, each one more terrifying than the last. The Woodsman was said to have once been a man like any other, a skilled hunter who lived off the land, until a tragic accident turned him into something else, something not quite human. It was said that his soul had been twisted by rage and grief, that he had become one with the forest, his body melding with the trees and the earth, until he was nothing more than a shadow, a ghostly figure who roamed the woods in search of those who had wronged him. The stories were enough to keep most people away, but there were always those who scoffed at such tales, who saw the forest as just another stretch of wilderness to be conquered. This was how Jack Taylor, a seasoned hunter and outdoorsman, found himself standing at the edge of the cursed woods, his rifle slung over his shoulder, a determined glint in his eyes. Jack had heard the stories, of course, but he didn't believe in such nonsense. He had spent his entire life in the wilderness, tracking game through the most rugged and inhospitable terrain, and he had never encountered anything he couldn't handle. To him, the forest was just another challenge, another place to test his skills and prove himself. He had come to this particular forest in search of a legendary elk, a massive beast said to roam the deepest parts of the woods. It was the kind of prize that would make any hunter's career, and Jack was determined to claim it. As he stood at the edge of the forest, the wind rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it a faint, mournful sound, like the echo of a distant cry. Jack shivered, but he pushed the feeling aside, chalking it up to the chill in the air. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let a few ghost stories stop him. With a final glance at the map in his hand, he adjusted his pack and stepped into the forest, the thick underbrush crunching beneath his boots. The trees closed in around him, their branches intertwining overhead to form a canopy that blocked out the sun, plunging the forest floor into an eerie twilight. Jack moved with the confidence of a man who knew the wilderness like the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of the elk's passage. He found tracks soon enough, deep imprints in the soft earth that led deeper into the woods. He followed them, his senses sharp, his rifle at the ready. But as he ventured deeper into the forest, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was a sensation that crawled up his spine, making the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He paused, turning slowly to scan the trees, but there was nothing there, only the whisper of the wind through the leaves. He shook his head, cursing himself for letting the stories get to him. He was too experienced to be spooked by a few old legends. But as he continued on, the feeling of unease only grew stronger, until it was an almost tangible presence at his back. Hours passed, and the forest grew darker, the canopy overhead thickening until it was as if night had fallen prematurely. Jack was deep in the heart of the woods now, far from any path or sign of civilization. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional rustle of an animal in the underbrush. But as he walked, he began to notice something strange. The forest around him was changing. The trees, which had been tall and straight, were now twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened and cracked as if they had been burned. The underbrush was thick with thorns, and the air was heavy with the scent of decay. It was as if he had crossed some invisible threshold into a different world, a place where the forest itself was alive with malevolence. Jack stopped, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, to leave this place and never return. But the tracks of the elk were still clear in the dirt, leading deeper into the woods, and Jack's pride wouldn't let him turn back empty-handed. He pressed on, his every step feeling heavier, as if the forest was trying to drag him down. The air grew colder, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of lost souls. And then, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness, he saw it. The elk stood in a small clearing, its massive antlers silhouetted against the dying light. It was even more magnificent than the stories had said, its coat a deep, rich brown, its eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. It was the prize of a lifetime, the kind of kill that would make Jack a legend. He raised his rifle, his heart pounding in his chest. But as he took aim, something stopped him. The elk was staring at him, its eyes locked onto his, and in that gaze, Jack saw something he couldn't explain, something ancient and full of sorrow. For a moment, he hesitated, his finger hovering over the trigger. And then, before he could make a decision, the elk turned and bolted, disappearing into the trees. Damn it! Jack cursed. Lowering his rifle and breaking into a run, he chased the elk through the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he pushed through the underbrush. But no matter how fast he ran, the elk was always just out of reach, its form flickering in and out of the shadows like a ghost. Finally, he burst into another clearing, and there it was, the elk, standing in the center of the clearing, its head lowered as it pawed at the ground. Jack raised his rifle again, his hands trembling with a mix of excitement and fear, but before he could take the shot, the ground beneath him shifted, and he stumbled, his rifle slipping from his grasp. He looked down, and his blood ran cold. The earth was alive. The ground beneath his feet writhed and shifted, as if something was moving beneath the surface. Roots snaked out of the dirt, wrapping around his legs and pulling him down. He struggled, but the more he fought, the tighter the roots became, until he was trapped, unable to move. Panic surged through him as he realized he was sinking, the ground swallowing him whole. He tried to scream, but the roots coiled around his throat, cutting off his air. And then, just as he was about to lose consciousness, he saw it. The Woodsman. He was tall and gaunt, his skin the color of ash, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, his body seeming to meld with the shadows around him. As he approached, the roots tightened their grip on Jack, pulling him deeper into the earth. "Who are you?" Jack gasped, his voice barely a whisper. The woodsman didn't answer. He simply stared down at Jack with those glowing eyes, his expression one of cold, implacable rage. "Please, let me go," Jack begged, his vision beginning to blur as the roots constricted his chest. The woodsman's lips curled into a cruel smile, and he reached out, his long, bony fingers brushing against Jack's forehead. The touch was ice cold, sending a jolt of pain through Jack's body, and then the world went dark. When Jack awoke, he was no longer in the clearing. He was lying on the cold, hard ground, surrounded by darkness. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay, and the only sound was the distant rustle of leaves. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. He was paralyzed, trapped in a body that no longer belonged to him. Panic surged through him, and he tried to scream, but no sound came out, and then he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere in the darkness. The sound sent a shiver down his spine, and he realized with growing horror that he wasn't alone. Something was in the darkness with him, something that was getting closer with every passing second. He could hear its footsteps, slow and deliberate, as it moved through the shadows, and then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. It was the woodsman, but different. His form was twisted and distorted, his body merging with the trees and the earth around him. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. He moved with an unnatural grace, his limbs stretching and contorting as he approached. Jack tried to crawl away, but his body refused to obey him. He was trapped, helpless, as the woodsman loomed over him, and then the woodsman spoke. "You have trespassed on my land," he said, his voice a low, rumbling growl that seemed to reverberate through the earth itself. "And now you will pay the price." Jack tried to plead for his life, but the words caught in his throat. He could only watch in terror as the woodsman reached out, his fingers elongating into sharp, bony claws. "You should have listened to the warnings," the woodsman continued, his voice dripping with malice. "But now it's too late." With a flick of his wrist, the woodsman plunged his claws into Jack's chest. The pain was excruciating, like fire spreading through his veins. Jack screamed, his body convulsing as the woodsman began to pull him apart, piece by piece. But the pain was nothing compared to the horror of what came next. As the woodsman tore into him, Jack could feel his consciousness slipping away, merging with the earth and the trees around him. He was being absorbed, consumed by the forest, until he was nothing more than a part of it. He could feel his body disintegrating, his flesh and bones turning to dust, but his mind remained trapped, aware of every agonizing second. He was becoming one with the woods, just like the woodsman before him. And then, as the last of his body was consumed, he felt a presence, a dark, malevolent force that had been waiting for him all along. It was the curse, the ancient evil that had twisted the woodsman into what he was, and now it was taking hold of Jack. He tried to fight it, to hold on to his humanity, but it was too powerful. It consumed him, devouring his soul until there was nothing left but darkness. And then the transformation was complete. Jack was no longer Jack. He was something else, something dark and twisted, bound to the forest for all eternity. He could feel the woods around him, the trees whispering to him, the earth shifting beneath him. He was a part of it now, a slave to the curse that had claimed so many before him. And as he took his first steps as the new woodsman, he knew that he would never leave this forest. He was trapped, a prisoner of the curse, doomed to roam the woods in search of those who dared to enter his domain. And so the legend of the cursed woodsman lived on, whispered by those who dared to venture near the forest. They spoke of a figure that roamed the woods, a shadowy presence that could never be seen but was always felt. They spoke of a man who had once been human but had been twisted by the curse into something else, something not quite human and not quite dead. and they warned of the fate that awaited those who dared to enter the woods, for the curse was always hungry, always searching for new souls to claim, and as for Jack, he was lost to the world, forgotten by those who had known him, his name fading into obscurity. But in the depths of the forest, his soul remained, bound to the earth, a prisoner of the curse for all eternity. And he would wait, in the darkness and the silence, for the next fool to wander into his woods, to join him in his eternal torment. Hey there, it's Mr. Night Horror. If you enjoyed this eerie journey and want to dive deeper into the shadows with us, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back with more spine-chilling tales tomorrow. Stay haunted.